In the coming months, Madam Speaker, the world will be watching a mission to space called Artemis II, the first crewed flight of NASA's Artemis program that will fly around the moon. It's an incredible time to be alive, Madam Speaker, that we can witness this iconic moment of human innovation in real time. And for Canada, this is not just another launch. It is a national moment. And for the first time, a Canadian astronaut, Jeremy Hansen, will fly as part of that crew. Canadian space robotics will be part of this visionary pursuit, and Canada's role will once again prove something we already know. When this country sets a clear objective and aligns its talent, capital, innovation, and institutions behind it, we can compete with anyone. And we have done this before. Canada became, in fact, the third spacefaring nation in world history in 1962 with the Alouette 1. We became a world leader in space robotics with the Canadarm in the 1980s, so trusted that this innovation in robotics became indispensable to our allies. And today, through our contributions to the Artemis program, particularly Canadarm3 for the Lunar Gateway, Canada has secured astronaut flights and meaningful roles in the next era of space exploration. So let me say this clearly in the outset of this debate today on our important opposition motion on sovereignty and economic sovereignty therein. Canada can build, we can invest, and we can lead. But there is a hard truth in this, Madam Speaker. Too often we are not translating our capability into lasting national strength. That is why I want to focus my remarks today on a critical part of our motion, protecting Canadian innovation, and requiring the Minister of Industry to present plans to Parliament to keep Canada's inventions, discoveries, and innovations from being sold off to other countries. Because right now, Madam Speaker, Canada is not building enough national champions. We are too often building sales listings, for example, that other countries come and take their pick of. And Canadian taxpayers fund the research that trains the talent and creates highly valuable ideas and inventions. In other words, Canada's intellectual property. But at the most important stage, when firms need to scale, when they should be growing into companies with hundreds, if not thousands, of employees with good-paying jobs, Canada's business environment too often nudges them towards selling, relocating, or being absorbed by larger foreign competitors. And so we fund the discovery here, but the long-term prosperity goes elsewhere. Time and time again, this is happening, Madam Speaker. And this is not an accident. It is a predictable outcome of a policy environment that is fragmented, slow, and largely indifferent to the results that it funds. And the Business Council of Alberta has noted that high taxes on capital combined with regulatory friction, high taxes and high regulation, we hear this all the time from our business leaders as the biggest problem in Canada. And so it reduces incentives for firms to reinvest and grow domestically here at home. And for many Canadian startups, the problem is not they don't want to leave Canada, but the gravitational pull of a faster, larger American economy, one that actively attracts talent, capital, and intellectual property and jobs, it's just too inviting. With government inertia in this country, it's just too tempting to go down there when it's more rewarding in many ways. So keeping innovation in Canada is, really not just an academic exercise for discussion. Our Canadian innovation is our economic power. It determines whether Canadians earn high wages. It determines whether our communities grow or are hollowed out, and whether this country controls the industries that underpin its security and prosperity. And when we talk about sovereignty in 2026, it is not just about our borders or our territory. Innovation sovereignty comes down to three things: who owns the patents, who controls the data, and who builds the capabilities here at home. Because whoever owns those things owns the future tax base, owns the high-skilled jobs, and leverages that in our trade negotiations, for example. That all goes together. And without sovereignty and innovation, we cannot be sovereign in our economy. So, Madam Speaker, I've spent the last 8 months as Canada's industry critic meeting innovators across this country, builders in space, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, AI, robotics, defense, advancing technologies. And their message is remarkably consistent to the problems that Canada is facing. They want to scale in Canada, they want to hire more Canadian workers, but our system is working against them. In fact, Canada has well over 100 federal innovation programs spread across various departments and agencies. And of course, each was created with good intentions by some minister, but together they form a system that is busy without being very strategic. It's not aligned, and really it seems very generous, but in fact it's not disciplined at all towards a strategic goal. And governments measure success by announcements and spending, by how many press releases they do, not whether Canadians can pay their bills or afford their mortgage, or that giving them confidence that their children will have more opportunities and a better life than they do. And so this link between innovation policy and everyday life is, of course, productivity. which we hear a lot about these days from economists and the Bank of Canada, for example, who has been clear that Canada's productivity problem has reached emergency levels in this country. Governor Tiff Macklem warned that unless we change course, Canada's standard of living will be lower, in fact, than it otherwise would have been. We will be poorer if we don't change course. A pretty drastic message from the country's, from the Bank of Canada governor, Madam Speaker. And the Deputy Governor, Nicholas Vincent, reminded us that Canada's affordability problem is fundamentally a productivity problem, because the only sustainable way to raise incomes in this country is to raise our productivity. But productivity is not about working harder, which I think is what a lot of people think when they hear that word. It is, in fact, whether workers have the capital and the advanced technologies to produce more and work less, to create more value more easily. And right now, Canada's productivity, in fact, is trailing the U.S. by 30%, and the gap is widening. Canadians can work just as hard, be just as educated, and still fall behind because our system does not support investment and scale. And that is where innovation policy becomes central. It's not because of Canada lacking any ideas. We have so much ideas and much talent, but we're lacking focus and ownership over those ideas, especially in the long term. And governments announce many programs, they launch consultations, and they publish frameworks, but our outcomes haven't improved. And Canada ranks last, for example, in the G7 for turning innovation inputs into economic outputs. More than half of industry-directed intellectual property generated at Canadian universities is owned abroad, for example. Pretty shocking. And once that intellectual property leaves, it rarely comes back. That means other countries are being enriched by our talented idea creators, Madam Speaker. And so this problem is especially clear in strategic industries like space and aerospace, which really aren't nice to have science projects. They are critical in the domestic and international terrain that we're seeing changing at a geopolitical level today. They underpin communications, navigation, wildfire monitoring, Arctic domain awareness, disaster response, national defense. They are central to NORAD modernization and allied security. If Canada cannot build and own and control these capabilities, we become dependent on other countries for functions essential to our sovereignty, something that Canadians have become acutely aware of in recent months. And that is why space, for example, is a powerful indicator of what Canada must and can, in fact, do better. And as Shadow Minister for Industry, I have seen this firsthand, these capabilities. I have toured Magellan Aerospace in Winnipeg, where skilled Manitobans build critical components to the world's best fighter jet, the F-35. Here in Ottawa, I visited Mission Control, a Canadian company developing lunar rover capability. It's quite amazing, Madam Speaker, and really these are the kind of innovations that strengthen Arctic research and security, the secure maritime safety, and really the role of Canada in the emerging space domain, which is critical for our national security. And so we have the talent, we have the capability, and we have the ambition, but what is missing is a federal innovative program and framework that really treats sovereignty as the objective, not an afterthought. And so that brings me to Part C of our Conservative motion today. It requires the Minister of Industry to present plans to Parliament to keep Canadian innovation in Canadians' hands, which is really not a radical concept. In fact, I would argue it's the responsible thing that they should be doing right now. It asks essential questions, sort of what technologies must we be controlling, what supply chains must be anchored here, what capabilities are critical to economic resilience and national security, and importantly, how do we keep these innovations here in Canada now and in the long term? And so without any answers, innovation from this government becomes really a scattershot plan. We're working harder but not together. And so this motion also recognizes that innovation cannot scale without capital, without more money, so to speak. That is why Part B proposes a Canada First reinvestment tax credit, which would defer capital gains when proceeds are reinvested, when the money is reinvested in Canadian businesses and productive assets. If capital stays in Canada, innovation has a better chance to scale here rather than leave to the U.S., and it creates more good jobs and higher wages and more opportunities for our kids. And this matters because investment per worker right now in Canada is half of that of the United States. William Robson of the C.D. Howe Institute told Industry Committee that U.S. firms invest roughly 3 times as much per worker. And so this needs to change if we're going to secure our economic sovereignty. And so to be clear, this tax measure must support a larger strategy. Tax policy alone cannot fix a system that lacks focus. So the central point of this motion is Canada needs an economic sovereignty strategy that prioritizes keeping Canadian innovation in this country. We cannot keep funding innovation and exporting our values. So when Artemis II launches, Madam Speaker, Canadians, especially young Canadians, will be watching and inspired. These are the future innovators of our country. We need to make sure that they can produce amazing jobs and innovation for today and into the future, and our motion is a central part of making that happen. Thank you, Madam Speaker.